Welcome to the CEEP Network and Living Church Digital Workshop. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the CEEP Network, and we are so pleased to be partnering with the Living Church today on this follow-up about theological education, and to have this terrific group of assembled panelists with us. And we want to thank you for joining us and thank the panel for sharing their wisdom and their thoughts on this very important subject. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Kincaid. And thank you, Elizabeth, for moderating the session. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks, CEEP, and thanks to the Living Church. It's great to be here today, and I'm really excited to get to hear from our panelists about this topic. Like Joe said, I'm Elizabeth Kincaid. I'm the Assistant Professor of Ethics and Moral Theology at Nashotah House. And I've asked each of our panelists, just to get us started, to share a little bit about their own educational context, about some challenges that they're seeing, or perhaps some successes, just to give me and each of you all listening a sense of what's going on in the place that they are teaching. So to begin with, we have Father Stuart Clem, who is the Professor of Moral Theology at the Aquinas Institute in St. Louis. Father?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm Stuart Clem. I'm Assistant Professor of Moral Theology and also Director of the Ashley O'Rourke Center for Health Ministry Leadership. I'll begin just by saying thanks, like Elizabeth did, to CEEP and to the Living Church for this opportunity. I've really been looking forward to it. I have lots of thoughts on theological education, and it's what I do pretty much every day, but I don't know that I consider myself an expert in it, so I'm very much hoping to learn from this session and to hear from my colleagues. So I think this is a really important topic that isn't discussed enough, so I'm grateful to be here. I'll say a little bit just about my own context and about Aquinas Institute of Theology. It's not technically a seminary, it's a school of theology and ministry that's run by the Order of Preachers, or the Dominicans. We're right on the edge of campus of St. Louis University. So that's an important context for us. It's a Dominican school right next to a Jesuit research university. Just a little bit less than half of our students are Dominican brothers who are in the midst of their formation process in their order. The rest of our students are a mix of lay men and women, a few priests, a few Jesuit scholastics who hop over from SLU to take courses with us, some international students. So it's quite a mix. I'm struck some days in class when I look out at my students and just think about all of the different experiences and contexts that are being brought into the room. So that's been a really wonderful aspect of my experience teaching at Aquinas Institute. As far as what we offer, we have 9 degree programs. Like many places, our core programs are the MDiv and MA in theology. We have 2 signature programs that we offer. One is a Master of Arts in Practical Theology with a specialization in healthcare mission. So that's something that I'm very much involved in as the director of the Ashley O'Rourke Center, which focuses on people who are actively working in healthcare. So they're not really our traditional academic students, or even students who are in kind of traditional forms of ordained ministry. Our other signature program is a Doctor of Ministry in Preaching, so a DMin, that is specifically focused on preaching. As far as I know, it's actually the only program that offers a DMin in preaching in the world. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a context of what I'm doing. Of course, it's interesting for me as a priest in the Episcopal Church to serve in this kind of context. I think I, in some ways, add to the diversity of what goes on inside of Aquinas Institute as well. And I'm active in parish ministry to a church here in St. Louis. The Church of St. Michael and St. George is where I serve in parish ministry. So that's a little bit about me. I'll just mention a couple of specific, well, actually, they're not that specific. They're sort of broad, but a couple of challenges that I see. And I'd be happy to get more into the specifics a little bit later in our conversation. The one thing that I I keep coming back to when I thought about, what are the one or two things that I would say that are really, jump out as immediate challenges. And the first one is just so obvious and so boring that I kept coming back to it because it's sort of the elephant in the room, and that's just money, right? I think that so many times our conversations around theological education dance around the subject or find euphemisms or ways to talk about money without really talking about money. And I think that it's really at the heart of a lot of the concerns I hear from folks on both the institutional side about the sustainability of our institutions, about concerns about enrollment and across the board. And also from the student side, when I talk to individuals, people I know who are interested in theological education, perhaps they have a clear call to ministry, or they're discerning a call, or they just want to study theology, but they have no idea how it could be financially feasible. And that's from one perspective, of course, been a challenge for anyone who wants to pursue theological education. But I think that the circumstances in the United States and Canada today make it increasingly difficult for folks discerning this. So that's, I just kind of want to get it out there, even though it's not really a unique insight. The other thing, which really opens up all kinds of doors, so I'll just kind of state it briefly and leave it at that, is what I would describe as the United States becoming an increasingly post-Christian society. And of course, we need to be a little bit more precise and think about, our contextual situations of our own parishes, regions of the country. And I don't want to paint with too broad of brushstrokes, but I think that we're only just now beginning to realize as a church, speaking of for the Episcopal Church, what it really means that this cultural shift is happening, and that so many people, especially Generation Z and young millennials, are becoming adults and coming out of a context in which they simply have no church background or very minimal church background. And I mean, there have been all kinds of studies on this, of course, but I think that we're just beginning to come to grips with what that means for the future of theological education. So perhaps that's something that we could talk about as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Father. We are now going to go to Hannah Mattis, who is the Associate Professor for Church History at Virginia Theological Seminary and our third Notre Dame. I realized we're very heavy on Notre Dame PhDs in this group. So Hannah, I'd love to hear about your context.
Again, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really grateful to see old and new friends. And yes, the Notre Dame contingent is strong on this panel, which is fun for Episcopalians after all this time. So I am an associate professor of church history at Virginia Theological Seminary. We have a student body. We have a number of programs. By and large, the student population, we have about, I'd say, altogether a community of 200 or so, but the cohort meets at different times. We have largely, our overwhelming proportion of the student body are traditional MDiv students who are headed for ordination in the Episcopal Church. I'm also the director of the MA program, so we have both international students from the Anglican Communion, many who've been ordained for a very long time, coming for further education at VTS. We also have domestic MA students from different confessional backgrounds. We also have a DMin program which meets during the summer, as well as, again, sort of variety of efforts. Many of you probably will be familiar with a lot of what VTS is about. So what I can say, though, for those of you who are curious, the pandemic was a really interesting experiment for us in terms of, what we are is a residential theological seminary. Virtually all of our students, except those who live locally, live on campus. And in 2020, when the pandemic hit, we made the decision to move everything online. It meant that faculty had to suddenly just transform their entire semester into an online curriculum. So that happened at the end, in March of 2020, but then carrying through into the following academic year. So our who are now our second year MDiv students, ironically, they spent, when they came here in their second year of seminary out of 3, they were walking into a campus that they had never physically been to. So right now at this moment, we have our first year students who are starting, our second year students who are having to adjust to an in-person year. During the year that we were all online, our chapel was turned into a vaccination clinic for the DC area. So we've had lots of conversations about how to keep our community safe. We at this point at VTS do require vaccination at VTS. We're hoping to be in person. We continue to test significant proportions of our student body every week, and we're hoping to be in person for as long as we can. However, as many of you who are working in a church right now are facing the same kinds of decisions about how, at what point will we have to move everything back online? What sort of decisions will we have to make to protect people? And so that is very much the space that we are in, where we are tentatively in person, but we've got our fingers crossed and we're trying to prepare as best we can for the winter and for things that we cannot foresee or anticipate. My perspective in this panel is very much as a lay teacher and educator in the church. I am very aware of conversations and pressure within the church around theological education after the pandemic. I'm very aware that the pressure is simply to move everything online, and for people to see putting everything online as a solution to what Stuart already alluded to: the money problem, the building problem, the institution problem. Put everything online. I work in a residential seminary. We do argue for the value of residential theological education. And yet we also have students who are in and out, and we're aware of what can be done with online technology, properly supported and properly used. Of course, within educational circles, the question of what can and should be online is a huge one and predates the pandemic considerably. So my perspective very much is, as with many things, the pandemic reveals rather than creates. I believe the potential for things online is great. However, my particular perspective is to remind everyone that there are things that going online can do well, but it does not do all things well. And to be very intentional about how we turn to online and electronic solutions when perhaps they're not the best. I think that we expect things online to be a magic bullet when they really aren't. So I would love to have the conversation around, what we think works. Particularly in education, I believe often that online tools and courses are used at the wrong level. Within education, many people put introductory material often online. And in my opinion, it's the introductory material that needs to be as in-person, as focused as possible. Once people have their feet under them, then you can put it online and something will work. But for beginners in particular, an in-person component is really important and really necessary. So we can talk about that, what that means in a church context as well as an educational one.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. All right. Our final panelist is Bishop Joey Royal, who is a suffragan bishop in the Diocese of the Arctic, which I imagine must be one of the largest dioceses in the Anglican Communion, 1.5 million miles. And he oversees theological education for the diocese, including its theological college, the Arthur Turner Training School. So speaking from yet a third context, Bishop.
Thanks. It's a real honor to be part of this. As Elizabeth said, I come from the Arctic, which is most of the northern part of Canada. Our diocese is big, 1.5 million square miles. Where I live is on the east side of that, in a community called Iqaluit on Baffin Island. And a little bit of interesting Anglican trivia, just outside my window here somewhere in Frobisher Bay is where the first Anglican Eucharist in North America was celebrated in I think 1578 by Martin Frobisher's chaplain. Anyway, so one of the things I do here, as well as being a suffragan bishop for the region, is run theological education, and I'm the director and primary instructor for Arthur Turner Training School, which is a small theological college run by the diocese, and initially opened in 1970 in a nearby community. The harsh Arctic climate gave those old buildings a beating, and we had to close it for a period of time. I reopened it here in Iqaluit in 2016, and have since graduated 6 students. So it's a small it's a small school. We're in partnership with Trinity School for Ministry in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, which has been wonderful. We are also supported by, other places like Wycliffe College. Some Wycliffe faculty have come to teach. We've had faculty from McGill in Montreal. So my context is one where it's a local initiative, my school is, but nevertheless in collaboration and partnership with larger seminaries. So I guess I should just say up front, I don't see these models of education as either or, but as an opportunity for further collaboration and to hopefully influence each other in good ways, and also I think to root theological formation in the life of the church. So I'll leave it at that for now. I can say lots more, but I'll pass the ball over to you, Elizabeth. But it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Bishop. It's great to have you here with us. So I will say, just listening to what each of you are pointing to, I think you are all coming from different angles, sharing the concerns that come up all across the board in theological education, which is, in this age of the pandemic, in this age of increased secularization, can theological education continue in the path that has gone? Should it change? How should it change? Where should the focus of theological educators be? Stuart pointed out money. Hannah pointed out the challenges of online education. Bishop Joey has pointed out possibilities for kind of creative partnerships. And I appreciate your point that you're doing something innovative, but it also depends on sort of these larger standalone seminaries coming along and helping and supporting. So there's a problem that I think everyone's sensing, and there is a number of different potential solutions. Why don't we start with specifically Hannah's concern in that framework about this discussion around online education as opposed to residential education, and particularly because all of us on this panel teach in seminaries that there is at least some residential component. So would love to hear kind of y'all's thoughts on that question. Hannah, you'd started us out by saying part of the question, online education isn't the magic bullet, and part of this requires discernment for how we're going to do online education. Stuart or Bishop Joey, what would y'all like to add to that? Stuart and then Bishop, actually Bishop and then Stuart.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just say something briefly. Online education presumes that you have internet that's reliable. And that's actually not the case for large segments of, especially remote areas. I imagine in the United States, it's the same. When I was at the House of Bishops, Canadian House of Bishops last week, one of the bishops said, the pandemic revealed that the internet is a justice issue. In other words, internet is really good in urban areas, not so good in rural areas. So there are just simply limitations around that due to a person's geographical location. The other thing, I think this is maybe not specifically an education point, it's a larger maybe theological point, but the moving of church services, worship services online during the pandemic has opened up a lot of really interesting theological questions. One of which is some priests, some dioceses have done virtual communion, a Eucharistic service online, and I suppose people hold their bread and their wine up to the screen, and it's sort of a revival of a kind of folk religion, I think. But the issue this raises is, what if you have in the Anglican Communion bishops who cannot recognize the Eucharistic celebration in another diocese? So I view that as a major concern. It's not directly related to education, but it touches on the church and touches on the role of online, the online component to all this. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it over to Stuart, Father Stuart.
Yeah, I appreciate Bishop's comments, and also a lot of what Hannah said resonated with me. And just I think that it would be extremely helpful to kind of the broader conversation around theological education if we all kind of committed ourselves to greater transparency and honesty about what the limitations and benefits are of offering online programs. Because on the one hand, I think we all recognize that online offerings can be a real blessing to people who truly do not have the opportunity to do a residential program. From another perspective, there are certain degree programs or certificate programs, or even just individual courses that can be offered online that really, actually, it's not just that it's kind of a second best, but really the only way to offer these kinds of programs. And I'm thinking of especially programs that are tied to very specific vocations. So the DMin program, for example, I'm not an expert in the history of Doctor of Ministry programs in the United States, but from my understanding, from the beginning, this is a kind of program that is for people who are actively involved in ministry and have several years of experience already in ministry. So these are not traditional academic students, graduate students. They're not people who are in their initial stages of being prepared for ordained ministry, but they're rather looking at ways to enhance their ministry and also draw upon their experience, not just their past experience, but their ongoing experience, and using that as kind of the stuff and the empirical data which you're working with to come up with a thesis project for your Doctor of Ministry degree. So that makes perfect sense. That's not going to be a traditional residential program where you stop what you're doing and you relocate. And if you have a family, for example, move your family to a new place and you're there for several years. So in that way, if we're thinking about what online education can offer, sure, it's going to meet the needs of all kinds of people, or it actually makes the most sense for them to be in that kind of program. But I think the trap that a lot of us can fall into on the organizational side is, again, coming back to this money issue, looking at the spreadsheets and being concerned about low enrollment, or people saying, I'd like to come and study at your institution, but this degree program isn't going to work for me or whatever, and thinking that we basically need to spread ourselves so thin and make sure that whatever we're offering can be sort of translated to an online format in hopes that we can just keep enrollment at a sustainable level without really thinking about what's best for the students and what really fits with our mission as an educational institution. So I'll just kind of throw this out there as one approach that we've taken. I know that VTS has done things along these lines. I'd actually like to hear if Hannah would like to share a little bit more about this with us. But at Aquinas Institute, we realized that we needed to do something to revitalize our core MA in theology and MDiv programs. And it's one thing to recognize a problem and say, we need more students, or we'd like to get a certain type of student. You know, you can wish for that all you want, but until you have a team of people who can get together and creatively think of ways to actually get those people in your doors, it's going to be a real temptation to just transfer everything online. And so what we've done is, I mean, thanks to the initiative of our president and several other great staff members here, spent years building up a new program called the Aquinas Scholars Program that offers just a fantastic financial aid package that covers all of tuition, offers a housing stipend, a book stipend, work study opportunities, and that opens the door for people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to stop what they're doing, stop their lives, and say, I'm going to come, you know, dedicate 2 or 3 years to study at this institution. Is simply making it doable for people. And I'm not offering this as, you know, like, you can't just wave a wand and say, okay, we'll offer these wonderful financial aid packages. I mean, that's actually part of the problem, right? It's a financial problem. But it begins with that commitment to saying, well, if we're committed to this mission and what we understand ourselves to be doing and the way that we want to form people theologically, we've got to stay committed to these core programs and not just assume that we need to spread ourselves thin through online teaching.
I think I would jump back in to say, again, sort of discernment about the value both of in-person and online programs respectively, and to do some careful discernment about what you're intending to do with either program. I noticed in the chat, you know, people talking about sociological, say, pros and cons, and you know, particularly to Bishop Royal's point about economic access. Absolutely, internet access is a prerogative of a certain social class, and to some extent, if the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Communion relies on the internet to hold it together, you've already pre-selected a certain portion of the population in a way that I certainly find problematic. What we've seen specifically within the seminary, we've seen a couple of things. This is to the sociological, maybe to the drawbacks probably of a residential program. After a year in pandemic, we've noticed our incoming first years, we have many fewer women than we would usually have. We have many more single men with no family to support. But we have very few women and fewer families, which suggests to me that people are not in a place at this moment with the pandemic to up stakes, change schools, move their kids, you know, commit to 3 years in seminary in such an uncertain space. That makes perfect sense to me. I completely understand that. And, you know, we have to obviously work within that. On the other hand, I would also say that, you know, without going into any specifics, I saw a great deal of mental illness in my students over the course of the pandemic. And I particularly saw it in those students who need interpersonal interaction to learn and to learn well. We have the biggest choir we have ever had since I've been at seminary this year. There is a real joy that the seminary is experiencing and coming back together interpersonally. And I hear that all the time. It's also the case that in an online context, the students who are academically formed are fine. The students who are struggling struggle worse and fall through the cracks. I'm sure you guys have seen this in public education. That's the real worry that a lot of public school teachers are facing right now, is that it's exactly the socioeconomically disadvantaged students who need interpersonal contact. So if we just, again, opt for online, either without knowing what we're doing or without recognizing that there needs to be a safety net for people, and particularly in a local formation context, we'll lose people, or people will come out the other end not fully formed or faltering, and we won't be able to support them in the way that we need to.
You know, Hannah, I really appreciate your emphasis on formation there. And I think that also goes back to the point that Stuart and Joey were making too, that, you know, we have to ask, what are we doing in theological formation? What are we doing in theological education? That we are forming ministers, whether lay or ordained, to serve the church, and that this isn't just imparting knowledge, it's actually forming the person. So on that note, we have a question here. that says, I'd be interested to hear your reflections on the emergence of competency-based theological education as a more intentionally contextual form, less dependent on traditional notions of residency. I mean, this is kind of, again, what are y'all's thoughts on that, Bishop?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. One of the things that we in our diocese have spent a lot of time with, one of the documents is called the TEAC grids, TEAC, stands for Theological Education in the Anglican Communion. And it was compiled through consultation across the whole Anglican Communion. It's competency-based or outcome-based, which means it answers the question, what sort of formation, knowledge, skills, experience, etc., does a person need to do ministry X or Y? And not only that, it assumes that education is an ongoing thing. So it's got a rubric for, as you're discerning a call, this is what you should know, and this is the sort of formation you should have. But then also there's 5 years down the road or in an ongoing way, this is the sort of formation and education and skills you should acquire. And the interesting thing about the TEAC grids is it's not only for clergy, it's also for lay ministers and just laity. And I think maybe sometimes when we think about theological formation, we think too narrowly. We think about the formation of clergy, but in a sense, catechesis and baptism is theological formation. Right, and any sort of formation of clergy has to be rooted in that and has to flow out of that basic catechetical training at the parish level, I think. So I appreciate that question, and that idea of competency-based or outcome-based is something that we have spent a lot of time on. Not only in training clergy, but also in discerning different lay ministries. And it's something going ahead I'm going to spend a whole lot more time with. So the TEAC grids, I recommend those as a resource for you.
All right, Stuart or Hannah, y'all have a comment on that, or?
I think I'd say,
oh yeah, Hannah.
I can just jump in and say, I slightly mistrust a too easy binary between competence and foundation. Obviously, if what you need is someone to teach you a skill, and that skill can be taught locally in your diocese, and you can do that effectively, and it does what needs to be done, go you. I'm not going to be the person to say, do not teach skills. And there's an element always in a local context where there are very particular skills that you need to function in that context. Far be it from me in a residential context to deny that. But I suppose the danger that I at least worry about is it works great until it doesn't. And then what? And then you've got nothing to fall back on. And one of the things that worries me about a church that is often as highly regional and varying in resource as the Episcopal Church, and I assume the diocese, in Canada as well, is that then, the particularity and the isolationism of the church gets worse and worse and worse if you don't have the experience of sending students where they meet people that are outside their immediate bubble. So that would be my main concern.
Great. Well, on that point, I think all of us have, like I said, expressed some concerns about online education used indiscriminately, or perhaps local formation without some sort of outside resources being brought in. And Hannah, I really appreciate your point on the danger of particularity. So what are resident weaknesses or challenges that you all might see in the residential or in-person model? And Hannah already highlighted something we also have seen in Nashotah House, that it does tend to be more challenging for female students or people with families. It puts a greater burden to uproot your family and move across the country, perhaps. And we've seen that on our side in Wisconsin as well. What are some other challenges that might come in the residential model? Bishop.
A couple of things. I don't know if you mentioned finances, but there's a lot of young clergy or even new clergy that come out of seminary with massive debt. So that is an issue. The other thing is there's just such a diversity of content in what is taught, and this is not unique to seminaries or whatever, but just across the communion, there's just a huge theological diversity of what is taught, which I think can't help but impact mission. And there's a theological diversity now in a way there wasn't in the age of, the spread of the British Empire, Anglican Church around the world. For better or for worse, there's just a lot more diversity now. So that has issues around transferability, potentially bishops as they discern, transferring a priest from one diocese to another, what kind of formation do they have, and so on and so forth. The other question, and this is about local formation versus, say, seminary formation. There can emerge often a two-tier view of the priesthood, where you have sort of the team A priests that are seminary educated, and the team B priests that are more locally raised up. I'm not saying that's formally stated, but that can often be implicit, and I've seen that a fair bit. So anyway, yeah, thanks. I'll leave it at that.
Great. So we have another question. We've kind of been touched on this about where do social justice issues fit into theological education? And of course, we brought up that there might be challenges around gender differences, cultural expectations. It's harder for women sometimes to move than men. We've talked about internet access and the challenges there, and we've been talking about finance. But kind of going more broadly than this, and of course, as an ethicist, I would say that ethics is all about justice, and I know that Stuart would agree with me on that. What else do you have any other comments around that question, social justice and theological education? Hannah.
Well, certainly one of the things we are seeing an awful lot of right now is that many of our students are coming in, and I think someone has touched on this already, but many of our students are not cradle Episcopalians. Many of them are recent converts. Often their formation is in a very different tradition. I would say at this point at VTS, we have about 1/3 of our population is evangelical or fundamentalist by background. About 1/3 is cradle Episcopalian and 1/3 is Catholic by formation. That's approximately, again, I'd have to look at the numbers as a whole, but it means that we spend an awful lot of our time trying to teach the church tradition and or trying to teach Anglican identity to students who are often very recent converts. And we spend so much time trying to cover these issues that social justice has a tendency, and this is the challenge I know at VTS that many of us face, of including it and giving it the priority that it deserves. Many of us are committed in that area, and certainly in DC, you can't not be aware of many of the political issues sort of haunting the American landscape right now. But I think the trouble for us is how simultaneously to honor the balance within 3 years and a tight curriculum of how to both form in the tradition and also give priority to social justice concerns, to which many of our students are deeply committed and maybe even know more about than they do their own tradition.
Bishop. Oh.
Well, I want to give Father Stewart a chance to speak if he I think he unmuted.
Oh, Stuart.
Sure, just a couple quick thoughts. Yeah, I really appreciate what Hannah said, and also one thing that comes to mind is just without having more context to that question, this is something that comes up a lot in my own work, and when I talk with people about theological education, and especially as someone who teaches courses in ethics. Oftentimes when people ask where social justice issues fit into not just theological education, but education broadly, there's an assumption that it's something that happens alongside education, or that it's a kind of appendix. And that, I mean, as you might imagine, that strikes me as a little bit odd for someone whose kind of day job is teaching ethical issues and moral questions. I mean, I teach a course, for example, called Justice in Catholic Social Thought, and so many of my other courses are really centered around these questions of justice. So I think one thing that's helpful for us to remember is that justice is something that is not just a matter of activism and advocacy, but also of intellectual inquiry. And I think we need to, I mean, that's one of the great challenges, but also gifts of the Christian tradition, is that we have all of these resources. It doesn't mean that Christians have all agreed or agree presently on the best way to practice social justice in the world. But it's a rare opportunity to be able to have these kind of sustained reflections, and sometimes fierce disagreements with one another in the classroom, but just to remember that it's also an intellectual and theological and spiritual question as well. And there's I think a reciprocal relationship between academic study and activism and ministry. And that's one of the great gifts and great challenges of theological education.
Thank you. All right, Bishop.
So in my context, the majority of people who live in the Northern Canada are Indigenous. Canada formally recognizes three groups of Indigenous people: Inuit, who live largely in the Eastern Arctic; First Nations, who live around the whole country; and Métis, which is a French word that means mixed. So there's the majority of people in our diocese are Indigenous, and many Indigenous people have suffered greatly and often at the hands of the church. So whenever I go into the cathedral here in town, every time I walk to the door, I walk by children's shoes and children's boots that have been placed at the door. And that's been placed by people in the community to remind us that the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church and some other churches were complicit with the government in setting up what we call residential schools, in which Indigenous children were taken from their family. There's no choice, they're just taken. They were brought to other southern or other places and not allowed to speak their language, and taught a very different cultural way. So we think about justice. I mean, my context is one in which the church bears this historical burden of having inflicted massive suffering on a population of people, and that can't be denied. It's a fact. So one burden that weighs on me heavily as a theological teacher and as a bishop is, and it's something I pray day by day, that as I teach, how do I know that I am not just imparting a new kind of colonialism here? One of the ways we ensure that the local culture is honored is any language can be spoken in the classroom. So there's one way. Fortunately, the prayer book and the Bible are both translated into the local language. That helps. The other thing, in bringing as many teachers in from this context to teach from this Indigenous perspective, now that raises a question of credentials, because often people from here don't have the same credentials as people in the Southern Canada and the US. So there's that. Also, I mean, it's very, very good that the Bible is not a Western quote unquote document. So that's good. It's not the Bible emerges from a culture and actually the church fathers, for example, emerged from cultures, not my culture, not their culture, an alien culture to both of us. So I find actually scripture and the early church a really rich resource, partly because they emerge from alien cultures, but also because they're dealing with similar issues. I mean, dealing with cross-cultural, multilingual contexts is nothing new for the church. But these questions of justice are big in Canada, and they should be. We just had a day of reconciliation last week, or I think it was last week, where people were all over the country wore orange shirts that said "Every child matters," and so there is a reminder that the church, to be a witness to Christ, needs to live up to our own ideal of justice, right, and repent where we need to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Well, we're kind of getting close to time. We've gotten sort of several questions around partnership with theological seminaries, perhaps partnering with dioceses, working to resource parishes better. And how do these ideas in service to the church fit in to theological education? Or there are some things that you all have seen working well, some thoughts, some suggestions? Hannah.
So certainly through Virginia Seminary, we have we have lifelong learning, which is the VTS is sort of on, that often produces a great deal of online material and curricula to support clergy. So it is a significant component of the VTS, sort of online programming, which we try to make available for people through webinars and other things. That's the formal or institutional answer. I think for dioceses and other institutions that are trying to figure out how to do this, as I say, I do wonder to what extent a kind of a DMin model, Stuart, mentioned the DMin program already. Even if you're not offering a DMin, if programming that's sort of done on the model of a DMin, where maybe you are a clergy person in a diocese and you have a course that's running over the course of a semester and you work on it by correspondence, and then you have a brief residential period that's intensive where you can get together. A model like that where people can work remote for significant portions of the time, and yet they can also get together and network and see each other and build relationships that way. You get a bit of the best of both worlds that way. And if your diocese, cannot afford to send people to seminary, it's a way to, make maybe resource people from outside the diocese who can support that kind of clergy education, without having to, without having to physically send everyone to seminary.
Stuart.
I think in general, one of the challenges that is unique to the Episcopal Church, because a lot of the things that we've been discussing, are challenges that other denominations and even just education more broadly are facing today. But in the Episcopal Church, it seems that we could be doing a lot better job of working at the local parish level to help people understand what the path of ministry looks like, both lay and ordained. And I think this is just anecdotal, but in my experience, it seems that the further a parish is geographically away from a seminary, the less likely that your average parishioner is going to have any clue what it means for someone to sense a call to ordain ministry and know what to do with the person who shows up in the church who does sense that call. And I will say, just again, painting with broad brushstrokes here, at the denominational level, I think that one thing the Episcopal Church does well is the diocesan level discernment processes. Again, there are exceptions. I know people who have had bad experiences, of course. I don't want to discount that. But I think on the whole, there's a pretty good structure in place for once you've kind of been able to gain some kind of support at the parish level, and you kind of move up the ladder into the kind of diocesan level where you're working with Commission on Ministry and the bishop's office and so on. But at that kind of initial stage, I've talked to so many people who said, I thought that maybe I was beginning to discern a call to ministry, but I didn't even know who to talk to, and I didn't know, if my church would really be supportive. Not just financially, but just really know what to do with me. And so I think that that's one thing that we can do is just we need to think about the way that we can provide resources to help people at that parish level to say, even if you're not called to ministry, this is something that the church discerns together. And we need to be thinking about how we can maybe even identify people who maybe don't even see that calling in themselves, but ask them to say, you seem to have these gifts for ministry, and we want to be able to support you and know what those next steps look like. I think that's one thing that we could definitely do better.
Great, thank you. Joey or Hannah? Joey.
I just want to say some good things about seminaries. I think one of the benefits of seminaries is that you have people teaching there who have given their life to the study of theology or church history or a particular discipline. I mean, we have 3 such people here on a panel. That's a really good thing. And often in local sorts of formation, you don't always have access to that level of expertise. And so there's something wonderful about people who have given their life to studying and who give of themselves for the upbuilding of the church. That's a really good thing. The other thing is, I think collaboration is really key. And I would say my little college up here is made possible by collaborating with seminaries, and I mentioned a few. The other thing is accountability. So for me, I'm accountable in what I teach to 3 different groups. I'm accountable to Trinity School for Ministry, who is the seminary we are in partnership. I'm accountable to the government of Nunavut to make sure that my program is a certain standard. In order for students to access government funding. I'm also accountable to the diocese to make sure that I'm equipping. So it's a tricky juggling act, but I view that as a good thing. I think it's a good thing.
All right, we've got 2 more questions we're going to do, and I'm actually going to answer one because I'm really interested in this topic. I'm interested in all these topics, but one of the questions is about the connection between theological education, spiritual formation, and leadership development. And I'm interested in this because this is actually part of my area of research. I do a lot of work at the intersection of business ethics, leadership, and theological ethics. And so I think that I'll let y'all answer too, but I'm going to share my thoughts. I really do think that this is incredibly important for the church. There are real resources in the leadership development literature. And I think that we are ignoring the natural goods that are available to us as Christians if we don't take that seriously and don't look for opportunities to draw on this as we think about what does it mean to develop people as priests. We've already done this well with psychology, for example, that we've realized that it's important to help priests be not only well-educated, but psychologically healthy, psychologically well-formed. And I think it's a very similar situation for theological education, that we should look at those resources. My concern and the danger becomes when we get our natural and our supernatural out of order, when we start thinking leadership development tells us why we're doing something instead of perhaps some of the how, and that we start thinking that we're forming CEOs, not priests or lay people who are good leaders. So that's my thought from my own research. Hannah.
So this is maybe actually to link the questions that was asked before.
Comment?
Sorry, can you hear me? Just
yeah,
saying, okay, good. I think my internet cut out for a minute. This is to link maybe the question that was just previously asked with this one. Teaching as I do, where I do, I think there is something very distinctive about the nature of working for the church. I have a very academic formation myself. I went through a traditional PhD program in many ways. And the difference between my own formation and what I am both doing as a seminary professor versus what, I'd be doing if I was teaching if I was teaching medieval history at a university somewhere, it's a very different kind of education. Seminary exists at seminary and local formation, theological education for service in the church generally, both, exist in a very interdisciplinary space where it's not as simple as focusing in on one discipline. Part of the art is juggling all these different areas, the business ethics and the practicalities of ministry, with the theological resources, with the ethical background, with the, someone asked a question a while back about the GOEs. One of the reasons I think they're useful, even if they drive students crazy or make them panic in their senior year, is that it's a nice, just quick temperature take on how well-rounded a student actually is. Can they function in a variety of different areas? So that's one of the challenges just of seminary education, but it is also one of the great benefits that it's a very integrative experience.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing back the GOEs. I meant to return to that question, and we've gotten so many, I forgot about it. So I do think that is an important point, that is a helpful focusing for students of bringing everything together in their 3 years of education. Other comments on the question on leadership? Stuart.
Oh, Elizabeth, I like the way that you the note that you ended on that, sometimes we might get the natural and supernatural out of order.
And
I think
that you liked that. So
well,
I can't imagine.
You know me. But when you said that, I immediately thought of, just numerous cases. I think we could probably all think of our own of, someone who is involved in ministry, who had a lot of, amazing kind of natural gifts, but then ended up having a kind of spectacular downfall. And we look back and we ask, how did that person get in such a position in the first place? And, there's kind of an obvious answer, but then there's still question remains, what went wrong here? And I think that's what happens when we get those two reversed. But I think your other point is a really good one too, which is, we would be foolish to neglect kind of the insights of these other disciplines and other areas of leadership that maybe aren't arising within a church context, but that can help us be better leaders in the church. I think we can certainly do a better job of integrating in that to the curriculum, a theological curriculum, because the reality of it is, I think that I don't have any studies off the top of my head to back this up, but I would say, just from talking to priests, one of the things that they say that they're the least ready for when they go into ordained ministry is kind of the business side of the church, right? Of having to, run a stewardship campaign, or, manage complicated vestries with competing personalities and interests, right? They're the kind of networking skills that you need to run a large parish and so on. Those are the kinds of things that I think we could do a better job of integrating into a theological curriculum, for sure.
Great, thank you. All right, one last question. So one of our listeners made a very good point that we've been sort of talking about tweaking the traditional seminary model a lot, moving some stuff online. What about some of these, what he describes as newer and more radical models, like St. Mellitus in London, or the Church Mission Society Pioneer Training based in Oxford in the Church of England? I know I have a friend and colleague at St. Mellitus. I don't know a lot about those personally, and the differences those would be than, say, just a local formation institute. But I'd be curious if y'all have any thoughts on that.
I would be curious. I don't know. Again, I have a colleague as well who teaches in St. Mellitus, but I don't know enough of the sort of day-to-day experience. One thing I would say, just speaking from the American side, England is smaller than the US is. I think it'd be easier to have a remote program where people can still have a degree of interaction and content. I don't know to what extent it's possible to create an ecosystem within St. Mellitus. I think if we tried to adopt a similar model in the United States, things would get very regional very quickly. And I sort of worry about that we would need to build the infrastructure and the culture before that's possible. It could well be that something like that is the next stage. Someone mentioned the seminary landscape is shifting slightly. At VTS, we're very aware of this, obviously, through our connections with General Seminary and others as well. So So we are evolving how to do partnership better. And as that develops, maybe we will end up with, again, a system, but it's an ecosystem as a whole, again, that we have to sort of grow from scratch. And so that's the tricky thing.
Stuart, Bishop.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm working right now at the very early stages with a seminary called Providence Seminary outside of Winnipeg in Canada, and they're sort of rethinking their approach to partnerships, and they're thinking particularly of working with rural, indigenous, isolated places. So that's right up our alley. And one of the things we're doing is developing a context-based model of education where instead of the classroom, so to speak, is the parish. And rather than classes, we have outcomes, and rather than assignments, we have inputs. So now I take Hannah's earlier point that I think this presumes that people have some formation and some knowledge already. I mean, it's a delicate balancing act where there is some. It might be hard to do the full training this way, but nevertheless, I envision this as ongoing training for clergy and lay people who have already had some training. But it's just a very practical reason that it's extremely expensive. It's a massive culture shock for people in the Arctic to go to southern Canada and go to a theological college. This is a way of bringing something of a theological college to them, and yet it's not a theological college in the same way. It's a kind of mentoring relationship. Now it has a theological college behind it, and there's obviously certain standards we need to meet. But nevertheless, it's a kind of coaching and mentoring that is going to happen with people in a parish. So, as I say, we're at the very early stages of this, and this will be a while before this takes off. But this is something I am pursuing, and if it were to work the way I envision it, it would be quite a different way of doing education, or at least a way of doing continual education for clergy. Because I think sometimes maybe we think in terms of, here's the curriculum for the 3 years that you're studying and then you're gone. But if spiritual formation is growing into perfection in Christ, that's a lifelong journey. Education, needs to be a lifelong journey as well. And so thinking about continuing education in this way.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I think we're going to, unless Stuart wants to jump in on this, I like the idea of ending this talk on the point that education isn't just 3 years, it's a continuing lifelong journey into perfection in Christ. I mean, and I will say that kind of answers the other question about, does being a theologian hinder your acting as a Christian? And hopefully not. Hopefully being a theologian leads each of us to continue to grow closer to Christ and to get to share in this. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks to our panelists. Y'all were so interesting. And thanks to Joe Swimmer and CEEP and Christopher Wells and the Living Church for sponsoring this.